Thank you, Presiding Officer. I certainly will not be alone as a member in this chamber in being grateful to the landfill tax for paying for some community facilities, in particular within the boundaries of my previous constituency. It built a new hall at Long Haven. The boundaries have changed. A certain Mr Salmon now has that within his constituency. I no longer do. And it's interesting, too, to hear that we're talking about something like 600,000 tonnes of CO2 being emitted. That's a very substantial figure indeed. Now, there's been quite a lot of discussion about whether we might have waste tourism. And I thought about this before coming to the Chamber, and I looked at a paper that was produced in 2012 for the European Environment Agency by the European Topic Centre for Sustainable Consumption and Production. It's a big paper, 96 pages, essentially looks at how landfill tax in all its multifarious forms works in the countries of the European Economic Area. There's quite a wide variation. But the one thing that's quite interesting in that paper is that there is very little suggestion, notwithstanding, as Mr Brown reminded us, what was said to the committee, that small differences could promote big tourism. There's very little in that paper to suggest that. So I think we have to suspend perhaps coming to an early conclusion on that. We do know that in the UK, landfill has gone down to less than half what it was over the 12 years from 1998, and we expect to see that go down. So I think we can be fairly clear that unless there is a draconian... Very briefly, please.
Hanzala Malik.
Thank you. My interventions normally are very brief. I want to take you to the future. You talked a lot about the past, and that was very helpful. In terms of less and less landfills being used, and I want to draw your attention to the fund that is currently used. And I was just going to ask you, where do you think that type of fund would come for those community groups as the reduction in the landfill tax reduces?
Stewart Stevenson.
It's a perfectly fair and good question. I think, for me, arguing from the constitutional position I do, it is unfortunate that you have a position where you're given a tax which is declining, which we want to decline, and you don't have the full range of taxation powers to do something about that within the overall tax system. So I hope that even those who might not travel constitutionally as far as I do might support the idea that this place should be responsible for all the taxes that are applied in this country, whatever the constitutional arrangements in future might be. Therein lies some of the answer. I want to touch on just a few perhaps disconnected things, and I'm going to go again to the European Council Directive 1999/31. And in particular, in looking at what we charge for landfill, one of the things at Article 10 is about the requirement to make sure that landfill sites charge enough to be able to, for a period of 30 years after they take in waste material, to look after that site. We've got some recent experience of difficulties in remediation in coalfields where there's been business failures. And I wonder whether, looking to the longer term, it might not be appropriate for governments to be actually taking in that money from operators so that the money is certainly around, because there appears to be less and less opportunity to get insurance cover. I don't think we should be looking at that now. That's for the future. But the bottom line is, this is above all about recycling. Now, recycling isn't something that was new. During the Second World War, there was a huge amount of recycling, and the world into which I was born immediately after that was quite recycling-focused. Paper, aluminium, jam jars, lots of things were recycled. And indeed, the focus on recycling that there was in the 40s, 50s, and perhaps into the early 60s is something that vanished. I'm delighted we're getting back to it, and I hope that we do more of it. That world also, of course, We looked at our use of resources more effectively. Our eating habits were much better. And one of the interesting things that under rationing in the war, infant mortality, I don't now have time, I'm sorry, infant mortality declined and life expectancy increased, even after taking account of casualties in the war. I just want to briefly, Presiding Officer, talk about a couple of wee things. And that is, I commend the use of provisional negative instruments so that ministers can act rapidly, immediately, in fact, but nonetheless Parliament can review what's going on. That's good. One thing, however, I do have a genuine question about, that we are going to tax disposals of taxable disposals that are made illegally. But if it's not a taxable disposal, can we tax it? Because, of course, there's things disposed of that are not going to be taxable disposals. A tiny thing on pet cemeteries, which Jim Murphy legislated for in 2005, which the bill currently says the disposal material has to be entirely of the remains of dead domestic pets. I hope that we might slacken that slightly to allow a container for the dead domestic pet to be also recycled. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, last week, a week ago today, Christiana Figueres, who's the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was moved to tears when she came out to speak to the BBC after a Chatham House event she was attending, saying, on the whole climate change issue, we're condemning future generations before they're even born. This issue is part of an extremely important agenda. And if I agree with anybody in the recent past, it's with Christiana Figueres. Presiding Officer.